happy to have you here, and welcome to our Climate Communication 101 panel, where we're going to walk you through how to weave narrative with complex climate situations and data. So I'm your host, Elizabeth Rosenbloom, and I can hear my audio on here, so I'm going to mute that too. And I am the founder of LumenArc Labs, where we make geospatial visualization and data tools for environmental consultancies and developers in order to better communicate their impact to their stakeholders. So I don't know about you guys, but this Climate Week has brought so many great events, but also amazing food. And I have really eaten a lot of pastries. So I thought I would go with something a little healthier, and there's just alcohol. So you're welcome. And whenever I go to these events, I've gone to so many Climate Week events at this point, I am always so curious about who I'm sitting next to. And so I thought I would do a little bit of storytelling about who all you are first. So let me show you a little analysis that I did. Okay. So when we look at where everyone is coming from, I mean, this is pretty intuitive, but most of our audience is from California. So we see a really high density of people from San Francisco, and then all over the US, mostly New York and LA. But then we also get a look at how many other places in the world people are from in our audience. So I have to apologize if you did not sign up for this event within, I don't know, yesterday afternoon. You're not part of this data set. But this is just kind of a general insight into maybe who you're sitting next to and the aerial view of what our audience is composed of. So looking closer, we can see that we have marketers, we have strategists, we have students in the audience, and we have CEOs, directors, managers, and these titles were also simplified for privacy reasons, but you can kind of get a general idea of who is here. And by understanding who's here, where they're from, we can maybe weave together why we would all want to learn about what storytelling can do for our businesses, for our professions, and our skill sets. And so when we look a little closer, we can see actually the vast majority are people that are CEOs or founders, managers, directors, engineers, analysts, and designers. So that makes up the majority group, but we also have writers, researchers, people in journalism, and this is just to give us a count. So 37 people that are either CEOs, founders, or both signed up for this event. And we can see that we also have investors. Engineers and directors. So our job for this talk is to walk you through what the 3 A's are in storytelling with data. And while we were preparing for this, we talked about, okay, what really makes good data storytelling? And we landed more or less on these 3 rules. So number 1 is know your audience. And that is kind of a banality at this point. Like, we all get told that all the time. And so what does that really mean? To know your audience is not to just know the statistical demographic elements of your audience. It's really getting on the ground and asking people questions about what they really need and what they want. So The second tier would be adapt your message to your audience. Adapting your message to your audience. All of us have to adapt messages to many different types of people. We may think that our business is very streamlined, and it might be. You know, you might have a very particular audience that you're speaking to, but in the pursuit of building a business, there are many different types of people that you're going to be talking to. There's people that are funding your business. There are your audience members who are giving you support. There are your customers. And so we need to adapt each message to each one of those groups. And lastly, and this is, I think, one of the most important rules, but don't make adversaries. So this is really important in climate communication, especially because of the friction that is caused when we're talking about issues that impose new lifestyle sets into people's lives. So we might all agree on what's happening in our climate. I at least hope so. If you're sitting in this audience and you don't, we can have a chat after. But even if we're all on the same page about these extreme changes that are happening within the climate, we all have different ideas of how to go about fixing it. And sometimes that can make people kind of uncomfortable. So we have to be able to engage with them, empathize with them, and do a bit of storytelling to first make them feel relaxed, and then just drive into a new set of ideas that maybe they were not exposed to before. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce my co-hosts, my speakers, the speakers of this event. So this is Eric Ressler, and
hey everybody.
Eric is the founder and creative director of Cosmic, which is a creative agency that specifically helps mission-led organizations and nonprofits to be able to speak their message to volumes. So he works with people that have sometimes really niche issues that they need to get out to the public, and he helps with the storytelling element for them to be able to do that. And now we have Robert Simmon.
Hello.
And Robert is a ex-NASA, ex-Planet Labs visualization specialist, also cartographer. And I think all of you guys are probably familiar with some of his work. So he made what is known as the Blue Marble, which was featured on National Geographic. And he's made many other visualizations that have been featured worldwide. So he specializes in making these complex topics easy to digest. And so to start, I wanted to know, when we're talking about knowing your audience, do you guys have any practical steps that a business owner could take to actually get to start to know their audience?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so because we work with a lot of mission-driven organizations, we often work with a diverse set of audiences or many audiences. And one of the big challenges that we find is that especially nonprofits and mission-led organizations sometimes struggle to create a narrative that works for all of the audiences. So they're like, well, should we be telling a story to everyone? Should we be creating individual stories for individual audiences? How do we prioritize those audiences? Those are some of the questions that we're often kind of grappling with when we're working with the organizations that we partner with. And the answer is, it depends, right? Sometimes you do need to create a meta narrative. And a very classic example of this is like, well, what's the narrative on your website going to be? You can't necessarily personalize that for every audience. Could you maybe have different pathways for different audiences on the website? Yes, we do that all the time. But it really starts from our perspective of understanding, how do we segment audiences in a way that is usable and practical, and not just kind of like a, you know, the standard like marketing fluff persona exercise. How do we do that? We utilize research, so qualitative research, a lot of interviews. We ask our clients to help put us in touch with the people that we're actually trying to reach and to support, and we listen. And I think a big part of being a good designer is, you know, empathy is a buzzword in the design world, but it's for a good reason. And empathy, I think a lot of times comes down to curiosity and listening. And that is really how we approach audience development.
So one of the things we were doing at NASA is I was working on a site called the Earth Observatory, and our mission was to basically get the fact that NASA was not just about astronauts, but also did Earth science out to a national audience. But it became quickly fairly apparent that we weren't trying to reach the general public, mostly because there is no such thing, but also because we're using the internet, and the internet is an active medium. And so people are going to your website because they're already interested in it. So it's people who are already interested in Earth, already interested in space, and already interested in technology. And so that meant we didn't have to reduce the message down to the basics, but we could both do a more sophisticated presentation with sort of deeper topics and longer and more involved, but we could also build up material so that people can navigate around and take advantage of the medium of the web, because this was back in the day when maybe that was not as apparent as now, and provide some of that background information. And so you could talk about what a wavelength was and what a band was, and get some of the basics that you need to understand the derived products and the measurements that NASA was doing for climate for the Earth.
Okay, those are great examples, and in those two examples, I feel like it's not necessarily directly adversarial. It doesn't seem like something that would be very divisive. So I wanted to touch on something that has come up a lot of times during Climate Week, which is food systems. When we're talking about food systems and we're talking about how to have a more sustainable diet, I kind of wanted to know if you think that there's a visualization component of this that can help with the storytelling element. It's kind of a complex question, but let's just think about Earth observation. There's other types of observations that we can make on land use change about, say, agriculture. I wondered if you guys have any ideas on just a storytelling technique or medium specifically for food systems, integrating what you guys already do. This is a case study project.
We did not prepare for this. I mean, the first thing that you mentioned is how do we, you use the word adversarial, which I think comes a lot of times with any kind of behavior change. So when we're talking about climate, when we're talking about, the personal behavior change and systemic behavior change that's going to be required to meet the scale of the issue. And, agriculture systems and food systems, and specifically, even meat, is a big part of that. And it's also deeply ingrained in culture. So what I've seen, and this is more of just a personal experience than a professional one, is that you have to meet people where they are. And if you start by just even, sharing data, right? I think a lot of times we open these conversations with data. Well, here's the data on how much of a negative impact you have when you eat, beef more than once a week versus when you don't. And for some people, they can see that and they can process that and logically, and they can make those changes because they care. And other people see that and they shut down immediately because they're you're threatening my culture, you're threatening my way of life. So I think it really does come back to understanding who is the audience and what are you trying to get them to do? Are you just trying to educate them? Or are you trying to get them to have some kind of behavior change? How would we visualize that? I mean, there's a million ways I think we could show the impacts of agriculture on climate. But yeah, that's the first stuff that comes to my mind.
Sorry for the curveball.
That's okay, that's fine.
Yeah, I think, I would just sort of approach it the way that I do pretty much any visualization problem. I think that adversarial part is really important. And that's also going to be highly dependent on your audience. If you're talking to a friendly audience, if I said, hey, it's really good if you would reduce your beef consumption, to this audience, I think everyone pretty much, if they weren't already a vegetarian or already cutting down on their beef and other sort of climate intense meals, you'd be receptive to that and maybe even feel a little bit guilty. But if you were to do somebody who's already sort of a little bit wary of a climate change message or you're responsible for this, or a lot of the climate denier talking points, that's actually one of the worst things you can possibly do, is sort of lead with that. So knowing the audience, and in some audiences you probably just want to avoid that completely. In ones that are maybe more undecided or more neutral, I would just be very careful about stepping up to it very slowly, build your credibility, do visualizations that interest people and evoke a sense of wonder, and maybe let them draw their own conclusions, which are the same sort of recipes that I would repeat over and over in telling stories. But for food in particular, I just think it's hard because it's so personal.
Yeah.
And so usually I would say don't be abstract, but maybe in this case, the abstraction helps. And start from the big picture, and then maybe finally at the end, maybe don't even make a recommendation, but again, try to get people to make that conclusion themselves instead of being prescriptive.
Can I say one more thing about
Yeah,
that?
absolutely. Yeah.
Something I found fascinating when I first started working on climate campaigns with people who've been doing this a lot longer than I have, is that I kind of walked in with this assumption that part of our job was to try and convince people that climate change was real and that we need to get more people to believe that. And I quickly learned that a lot of advocacy-focused organizations have very little interest in that, and there's a good reason. And they're like, no, we just need to activate the people who already believe this to actually take action. And that was a huge, and I'm not saying there isn't a place to try and convince and to create behavior change, but I don't think we necessarily always have to.
I think that's a super important part to touch on because of the fact that you're rarely going to change people's minds that are on the very opposite end of the spectrum unless it's a one-on-one transformation. So when we are talking about hitting our climate issues where they matter, yeah, I guess activating people that are already feeling impacted, aware, and potentially passionate to just really take practical steps and making that easy for them. And so that still is in the galaxy of topics of how do we simplify technical information without losing accuracy? But this is something that we've touched on. And so that you guys get some context too, I have reached out to a number of you in the audience, and these are questions that have now been aggregated to theme. So these are trying to answer things that you guys have asked. A lot of you have reached out and wondered how you can integrate storytelling, but when it's a climate issue, how can you try to get these technical topics into something that is digestible, but yet still accurate? So yeah, technical, but accurate.
Yeah, I'll start with that one, I guess. So one thing that we find when anyone really wants to start to get into using data in a serious way is that they often can feel paralyzed because of some of the downsides of data being inaccurate or incomplete or messy. And what I've observed in my work is a lot of times that leads to people just kind of shutting down and just saying, well, it's just too hard, let's just not do that. And what I've tried to advise clients that we partner with is well, what do we have to work with? We don't need to go from zero data-informed storytelling to the panacea of data-informed storytelling. What is the data that is accurate, that's reasonably accurate? If there are bits of the data that aren't accurate, is there a way that we can honestly share that but still have the data be somewhat useful? So what's the first step that we can take there? And I think that if you start to approach it that way and then build culture and structure around getting better data, understanding the impact of the work that you're doing, and setting up better systems and protocols and a muscle for measurement over time, then you will slowly begin to have better data sets to work with. And my opinion and my perspective is shaped by working largely with small organizations who don't have huge teams of researchers all the time. Although I've also worked with organizations like Mbari who do have big teams of researchers and do have incredible data sets. So I think similar to you have to start where your audience is, you also have to start where you are from a data standpoint and then start to just build that up over time.
Totally. Maybe you haven't accumulated all the data, or maybe it is non-standardized. It's messy data. And so you might have a bit of a problem understanding how you can share a narrative while it's all over the place. But I would say just focus on the small. So focus on the story that can be achieved with the accurate data that you have, and start from there. Use it as a case study. People love case studies. That is part of storytelling. If we think about what is comprised in a story, it's often a single character, right? We follow them through. So that same concept can be applied to data. So yeah. Robert, you go ahead.
I would say that experts tend to worry too much about accuracy because they're very much used to talking to their peers, and they are not used to talking to audiences that don't have a PhD in what they're studying and then a 15-year career after that. And they're very obsessed with the reaction they get in a conference and the person that stands up and calls them out. You don't have to worry about that. I mean, I also disagree with the concept of like dumbing things down, but you don't have to worry about like very technical language. In fact, stay away from it as much as humanly possible. Don't obsess about being overly precise, but get the message across that you're trying to get across, and focus on how to do that.
And with that, do you guys have any examples of something that took technical information and broke it down into something a little bit more digestible?
I mean, that was kind of that's basically been my entire career, at least at NASA.
Okay,
I mean, that was what we did.
nice.
So yeah, we already talked about making these personal. So the approach, again, I'll use Earth Observatory as an example. We actually sort of had different types of stories that we produced sort of in parallel and put up that were all sort of like mutually reinforcing. So we had what we called feature articles, which were sort of like the classic science magazine where you have a protagonist who has a mission, who's maybe curious about Venus, and then started looking at runaway greenhouse effect, and then realized that there was, we were increasing CO2 in our atmosphere, and then that became his life work. And so that's actually Jim Hansen, who was the director of GISS and is was one of the leading climate scientists for decades. He came from Venus, and not from Venus, literally. His research interest was Venus, and then he became much more interested in Earth, and that became his life work. And so we focused on that very human story. But we would also do sort of these more abstract, what we called evergreens, that are more like a textbook, that like break things down and look at pedagogy and how do you explain it. But then we would also have sort of these rapid cadence image of the day or natural hazard stuff where we just put up compelling imagery that sort of just were like a baseline. And it might be, global temperatures for the year. It might be the Keeling curve was up, add another year to the Keeling curve. But it might just be imagery of a hurricane or a rainforest, with or without deforestation. And like all of these things sort of like reinforce each other. And so it was more of, instead of like focusing on the single, we were focusing on having this larger body of work that all fit together.
So all the work that I've been just clicking through this talk just now is all Robert's. So
some of it's
these are
times in Bloomberg.
okay.
Okay, so yeah, I guess
let's get clear on that.
I also did have one point that I wanted to make. That also, I think you go to the previous slide on this one.
Okay.
Where the other thing that we did that I think was really key at Earth Observatory was step away from the way that scientists presented data and present data in the way that science told us we should be presenting data. Because most scientists learned how to present from their PhD advisor, and did things that were maybe limited from the technology of the time, like 80s computers that could only display 8 colors, not 8 arbitrary colors, but literally you had 8 colors to choose from, like that. And then, so the palettes devolved from that, derived from that. Having projections that are limited to Web Mercator because that's what your software shows. And so like you see these weather maps. This is actually, I'd say, like on the medium bad scale as opposed to the very bad scale. But it's government data, so I can show it. And like you see these weather maps that they're just bad. And then if you flip to the next one, here, exact same data set, but it shows patterns much more clearly. It's much more appealing and it invites you to go in and look at it. And so like having good design and using just what is now sort of like baseline data visualization techniques. Like we don't have to use those 80s computers anymore. We've had 45 years of advancement in technology. And cartography solved these problems like literally 100 years ago, and just use those techniques. And I think that's a baseline. And then you build up the other things that we've been talking about on top of that.
Okay, excellent. What about you, Eric? Do you have any specific examples of technical data being digested into a visual asset or storyline?
Yeah, can we pull up the New York Times neighborhood example? Let's screencast this one. Yeah, so this one, when we're trying to find some samples, this one popped in my brain immediately. I think the New York Times does a really good job with data visualization in general. And this one really stood out to me. Yeah, that's the one. Because they found, and they've done this in other examples as well, but they found a way to make a map visualization, a narrative experience in a way that was really interesting to me, and then personalized as well. I'll wait for it to come up on the screen so I can talk through it. Yeah, so this is mapping the impacts of climate kind of neighborhood by neighborhood, county by county across the globe, mostly North America, I believe. And as you, just press play, there we go. As you scroll through this experience, you get context for what the map is describing or displaying for you. And I believe at the end, I'm not sure if I have this in the screencast, but there's a way that you can put in your own neighborhood and get some personalized data, which I always think is really impactful as well. Yeah, I think I scroll around on the map here a little bit, eventually get to San Francisco. And there's some cool, takeaways from this, that the most dense and urban areas have the least amount of climate impact, which we know. For example, and suburbs have more climate impact even though there's less population. So there's just cool perspective shifts that can happen in these experiences, which is a lot of the times. And then I keep scrolling here to show that they also bring in some actual photography to humanize the data a little bit. To me, when I think about trying to convey a message or tell a story in some way, I think about data as being one of the tools that we have. And I think that data is a tool that can really shift perspectives and change the way that you understand a concept in a way that even human-centered storytelling can. And I think that this is a good example of that.
Yeah, story or scrolly-telling is one of my favorite formats to actually condense so many different mediums and really allow people to take what they want from it. You're not going to hit the nail on the head with any single type of medium when you're talking about data. So you could show a graph, somebody could be really compelled. I'm not saying go all over the place, but you can maintain a focus in a presentation of data while also integrating a lot of different mediums. And that includes really good copy, good photographs. And I personally love the geographic elements of it, as you guys probably saw in my earlier visualization of you guys, because we all have spatial data, and most data is spatial in its nature. And where things are from, where they're taking place is a really interesting component a lot of times to a story, right? We get the setting, we need to place the character somewhere. And so that's often an inherent component in data storytelling.
Do we have time to do the spiral? Could we bring that up too?
Yeah. We're gonna show another example of really effective data storytelling. And this is a fairly simple graphic, but I really enjoyed as well.
I'd actually be curious to know how many people have seen the spiral. It's probably most people in here, but maybe not, I don't know. Yeah, does everyone raise a hand if you've seen the climate spiral before? Yeah, I figured a lot of people, yeah. For whatever reason, when I saw this, it blew my mind. Even though I knew this to be true, and I've seen this same data set graphed in different ways, for some reason, when I saw the spiral and the way it's visualized, and especially it becomes 3D at the end here, and you can kind of see the trajectory of the data. This is an example of a simple visualization that, to me, really changed my perspective or widened it in a way that I personally never probably would have come up with this way of graphing this data. But I was inspired by it. Maybe you know the background of this.
I think this was a little bit after I left NASA,
Okay,
but I think it came out of either the SVS or Josh, who took my job at Earth Observatory. Not took, but replaced me.
Yeah.
I left voluntarily. This is actually a really interesting case because it breaks a ton of data visualization rules. It's actually not very intuitive. It's not very quantitative, but it's extremely engaging.
Yeah.
And that in and of itself is extremely valuable. So it's not how I would approach the data set, but it is a very effective way of getting across the extent of warming and has reached audiences that the drier, more technical presentation that I'd be drawn to for this particular data set don't. And Al Gore does the hockey stick all the time. And he's the exact wrong person to be doing this because he's already a politician. And he turns people's brains off immediately when he starts talking about things, no matter what it is, it sucks, but that's just how human brains work. If there's already somebody you distrust and they start saying something, no matter what they say, no matter how convincing they are, you've already lost the battle when that person is your speaker. The more relevant point to this data visualization is, again, it's engaging, it's novel, it grabs your attention, and that is as important, and in some contexts more important than having the most precise data set possible and the most analytic way of presenting the data.
So I think that touches on another question, which is derived from our audience questions, which is what frameworks or playbooks help persuade diverse audiences? So this is sort of breaking what we were saying in adaptation. When we're talking about diverse audiences, that is a real pickle. It's really hard to talk to a huge crowd of people who all have different interests. But I know that both of you guys have tackled that in your own work. And so first, maybe speak on behalf of it. And if you have an example, great. If you don't, that's all right.
Yeah, I mean, I think it actually can be quite simple, not necessarily easy, but if you're trying to reach a diverse audience, you need the people trying to reach them to reflect that diversity. So if you're trying to reach a particular population, you have to understand that population, and the best way to understand that population is to have an effective representation of that population in the decision-making side of the table.
I'm going to go with a completely opposite way of looking at it. I think that's actually also a very good answer, but if you could bring up the Nights at Light, the Earth at Night image.
Okay.
And so you can actually go global and go to things that resonate across cultures, across communities, like the original Blue Marble and the original Earthrise photos. Those had global impact because they put the Earth in a new perspective. So go to the one that's the full Earth first, and then we'll walk. It's up, one down from that. Okay, so Earth at Night. This is the 2012 version. I originally did it in 2000, which was taking this very dry data set that NOAA had produced. That was literally just counting light at night. And they would do it on a black background. It's just white points, black background, red ones for fires, green ones for gas flares, and then blue in the oceans for fishing fleets. And I was like, well, Hollywood, when they're doing night scenes, they don't do it at night. They film in the day and they put a blue filter on it. So I'm like, well, I can just take a Google map and put a blue filter on it and then put the light data on it. And that context, I think completely revolutionized the appeal of this data set. And so it speaks to very wide audiences because everybody in some way or another is in this image. The other thing I really like about this is it allows people to derive their own conclusions and discover things that are interesting because these relationships are actually pretty obvious. So go to the next slide. One that reached out to a lot of people is the difference between North and South Korea. So that line is the DMZ, the demilitarized zone that separates them. North Korea, you got Pyongyang, a couple coastal cities, that's it. Yeah. This is an impoverished country. Being a hermit kingdom and putting North Korea first, bad for your country. South Korea, very global, thriving. So you can see all the cities and the urbanization. You can also see in the oceans, these vast fishing fleets that are international. These are probably Korean because they're in the coastal waters, but other ones. So that's another thing you can see that's brings questions and engages an audience. Go to the next one. The Nile, where you've got this very narrow strip of water in a desert, and almost all of the rest of the area is very low population. Go one more. Conurbation between Boston, DC, Richmond, where all of these cities are melding together to the point where in many ways they're one thing and then one more. The other thing is that when you present data sets in a way that people can instantly interpret, if you go to the next one, they can evoke questions. So here we have the Australian outback, which is as low population as the Sahara, but it's got all of these lights. Anybody know what they are? They're fires. Yeah, so they're bushfires, which are a natural phenomenon in Australia. You know, they happen every year. They're getting worse, but this was people were constantly asking about that, and I really engaged them and got them to think about the data and not just look at it and then throw it aside.
Thanks for taking us through so many specific examples. I also like getting the walkthrough of the geography and just like imagining why I've never been to Egypt, but I've always wanted to just see how dense that population is. But that is a really great example of how visualization and even really simple visualizations, especially with context, can really ignite people's interest. So like maybe you see that on the street and you walk by because we're all bombarded with imagery. So when we're talking about visualization and imagery, it's not just like what's the most showy thing, but how can you entice them with a story? And that also happens with your copy. Of course, it depends on the medium, but that kind of merges into my next question, which is what role does storytelling play in scaling climate solutions?
Yeah, a big one, I guess.
Very true.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I've been reflecting on kind of in preparation for this panel actually is, without getting into a state of judgment, but like, why hasn't this worked? Like, there's such an opportunity for humanizing the story of climate change. It's a global problem. It affects every human in the world. And somehow we have not been able to break through and humanize the issue. I think that's starting to change as the actual effects of climate change are becoming more real and more individual every day, which I've experienced. I'm from Santa Cruz, so we've had fires in the last couple of years. We've had huge storms. Maybe you guys have seen the wharf fell into the ocean a couple months ago. So my podcast co-host and my good friend Jonathan Hicken runs the Seymour Center in Santa Cruz, and he's been struggling with how do we communicate. We're a coastal science center, we're an aquarium, but anytime we say climate action, we get less attendance, we get less participation. So how do we handle that? And I found his approach to be really interesting, which is that he's focusing on the facts and not labeling them, just sharing stories about what's happening and inviting people to get curious about the wharf fell into the ocean. I wonder why that happened, right? Like, what can we learn from that? And like, how is that changing and how is that different? And that kind of, and he also does a lot of solutions-focused storytelling in his work as well, pointing out what can we do? Because I think one of the things that's so hard about an issue that's so systemic and so global and so tied to politics and power, you sometimes feel like you're an ant trying to push a glacier, right? Like, what can I possibly do? I can change my diet, I can change my travel, I have control to some level, but like, this is truly a global problem that needs to be solved. And a lot of people don't seem to be too interested in solving it right now. And it's interesting to me from a storytelling standpoint that between all of the factors at play, somehow we've not been able to humanize this story in a way that's effective. And we can all talk about after the panel maybe why that's true in certain ways. Is it political will? It certainly isn't data. We have plenty of that. But somehow we have not been able to turn this into a movement that is effective at the scale and the pace that we need to. And even though storytelling is not going to be the only thing that solves it, I don't think we give up on that. I think we have to continue to try and look for what are the things that actually work from a storytelling standpoint. And maybe even more importantly, like, who are the right people to tell those stories? It's probably not politicians, especially right now, as the issue has become so political. But it's also not fringe activists probably either. Nothing against fringe activists. Like, we need activists out there doing the work too, but we somehow have to make this a household issue. And for some reason, it just hasn't become that yet. So yeah, I'd be curious to talk to everyone about that.
I think getting away from sort of like the personalization part of it, the reason it's not successful is because there is a concentrated group of people who are opposed to any type of climate action, who understand psychology and understand rhetoric, and have a certain degree of media capture, and they are actively destroying any type of effective climate communication. And it is much easier to sow doubt than it is to make a case to make action. And so it's an uneven fight. For decades, they took advantage of the media's need to have balance, even if there is no balance. Science reporting has gotten much better at that in the past 20, 30 years. Political reporting, sadly, has not. But you can't just interview two experts on two sides and like assume that there's some equal validity in their two perspectives. There are things that are actually objectively happening, and there are things that aren't. But it's really easy to sow doubt, and we're seeing that repeated in many veins. And it's the same people who were advocating, for tobacco companies. Like, there's no degrees of separation between these people. But individual action isn't going to help. So you need these big global things that have always been hard to impossible. So it's just, and I might sound a little frustrated, but I spent a career advocating for this type of stuff, doing it in a way that really resonates or appears to really resonate with people, and it feels like it's failed. But I'm going to keep trying. And again, just do things that are inspiring, do things that interest people, do things that engage and draw people in.
I would add, get at people's selfishness. When we're talking about companies and we're talking about what is their vested interest, how are they going to save money doing whatever you're doing? Or how are they going to save money or engage more people following whatever protocol you're presenting to them? So I feel like sometimes why we make adversaries is standing on some sort of moral podium, and that is a really quick way to make an enemy. That's also a way that I saw when I was studying environmental science, how there's, I don't mean to be generalist about it, but there's kind of the people that come from an emotional standpoint and they go, well, save the earth, because all of us care and it's beautiful here. And then there's the people that come from more of a scientific perspective and they're like, look at this data. Doesn't this matter to you? And, neither of those methods really seem to work. So when we're talking about engaging the people that matter and that are actually making decisions, we do have to think about what type of solutions can we make that are getting at their inherent interests. How many of you guys, we're going to do you want to write down your question? Because we're about to do Q&A in T-minus 2 minutes, actually. This is going to be the closing. I just saw the time. Okay, so I'm closing out here. But on the note of, I want to first see, did anybody go to the geothermal house? Hell yeah. All right, we have 2. Okay, awesome event, but I encountered somebody there and we had a conversation and I was like, why are you here? He's like, I'm not interested in geothermal. I'm like, all right, that's an interesting way to start this conversation. And we started talking about the transition, why would people adopt geothermal? And in the case of LA, where we're talking about preventing future problems, it's not so much that governments are just evil and they don't want to aid with this, or that architecture firms don't want to employ these systems. It's that the education is not there, the storytelling is not there. So how can you get at the people that are making the decisions, or at least letting those decisions percolate, would be your first job if you're trying to make a difference. How can you get in with an influencer that is then talking to other people within their network? Land development is a great point, within LA. But it is within LA's interest to make geothermal or other alternative energy sources available to them. So I think always considering the lens of the financial component or the power component of it for somebody else is a good way to start the foundation of the know your audience component, right? And then adapting that message and then more than anything, not making an adversary, because you want to know what they want. So that's how I'm going to close this out. But we're going to start Q&A. So I would love it if you asked your question. Do you want? You can come up, or if you can shout. Okay.
Hi everybody, my name is Danish Mir, and I have worked in, I've training in information management and data visualization was a big part of it. So I worked in ESG reporting, and that's the corporate space of climate activism, you can call it. And I would say this add on what the discussion is here. So a lot of work which we do there is qualitative, not numbers.
Yeah.
And I would struggle many times to put that in a visualization like this because it is text. Now there are new contemporary tools which are coming up, but I think personally accessibility to those tools, one, the technology is, you have to pay for it, and many times your manager doesn't want to pay for it. And second time, the learning curve, even if you have accessibility, like it's not a drag and drop, you have to learn it. That has been a limiting factor. And I would say, I would like to actually have a comment from the panel here. What do you think in terms of accessibility for the opportunity for this AI space to break that barrier for someone like me who has limited understanding or less than understanding to use visualization as a tool for climate activism inside corporate or outside in the world?
Do you have thoughts, Matt?
A few. I will say I'm deeply skeptical of AI as a solution to a lot of these problems. I think it is very good if you can distill your challenge down into something that's pretty narrow and easy to check. So like, instead of, can you get data to show, I don't know, energy consumption in LA for 1995 or something, and like make me a graph. I think you need to break down each of those requests into separate pieces, and then make sure that you're getting the right thing out of each one. As far as accessibility, I really wish that this community was more focused on end users and less focused on developers. It's kind of a soapbox that I will jump on at any opportunity. Almost all of the innovations in data visualization and accessibility to climate data have come in the space of you are a developer, and not in you are an end user. And so it's cloud native and stack catalogs and Earth Engine, which are they're all programming. And they're not particularly well documented programming. And you have to know, again, like a scientist, you have to have 10 years of experience to even understand what's going on. And so like there's a huge space for somebody to focus on a earth science and remote sensing and climate visualization tool that is emphasizes usability. But nobody seems interested in it because it's not sexy.
Well, and to get at your tools question, I don't know. Okay. I would say, like, if you are coming at it with passion and a love for visualization, there's so many tools that are open source. Like I for one love to use Blender. Like Blender is an amazing tool, and there's a lot of creative ways to go about visualizing data that don't require really hefty software. Does it require a ton of time? Yeah, it requires a lot of time for you to like go through the storyboarding, but that's what I would implore. Like, don't think about it in terms of tool. Write out like the storyboard first. Like imagine making this an immersive experience, even if it doesn't end up as something that is AR, VR, or like 3D of any sort. You can think of it as like an immersive experience, because I think people that are in the craft of data visualization, they're visual people. So you can use your imagination and start to like figure out not first what tool am I going to use, but what do I want to create. Also on the subject of AI, I mean, I'm not bullish, but I'm not bearish on AI in terms of its applications within visualization. There are certain like RAG models using proprietary knowledge and data from like a specific industry that you could get like pretty great precision on by feeding it, let's say your company's data. And then from there, you could say, all right, like give me a predictive model of where we're gonna have vulnerable spots for leakage. Okay, so like let's say with utilities data. From there, you have this sort of either visualization or data that like from that you could really create into something that's just like a simple, you could do something on Photoshop, right? Like a representation of this data that's visual, but it's using pretty complex systems. So I think that there's the complex, then reducing it into the more simple. There's the simple data, making it more enticing for a broad audience by not making it more complex, but maybe making it more visually interesting. And yeah, this is a big question, so I would love to talk all day about it, but I'm gonna step off. You have anything?
No.
Okay, any other questions? So,
Hi, my name is Anshu. I'm a journalist based in DC, and I'm also part of the Climate-Based Fellowship. I've heard lots of different things throughout the fellowship and a little bit before from journalists, from communicators, and other people from different backgrounds about numbers and how actually that doesn't appeal to the masses really. But then I do think there is, I don't know, as someone who I think I need to put the numbers and put that into perspective. I always thought numbers were important to a story. So I wanted to know your opinion on how to use numbers. Is it better to not have any numbers in the copy of the article and just let the graphs and the data visualization speak for itself, and how to incorporate the numbers? Because to me, I think numbers and quantitative research is important to storytelling and then humanizing it and putting it into perspective. But I've heard lots of different theories of people saying, well, forget about the numbers, just like Heaven said, like humanize it. So I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people are more influenced by data than others. Like we know scientists and academics and deep researchers care a lot about the data because they understand the context of the data in a way that your layperson doesn't. I think your intuition is right, in my personal opinion, around including numbers can be a really effective and important tool. But I think you always have to, again, start with like, what is the purpose of the piece of communication in the first place? Is it to educate? Is it to inform? Is it to inspire? Is it to create some kind of change or action? And dependent on the outcome that you're building towards, numbers become more or less important at that point. I think especially when it comes to journalism, which is your background, and it depends again who you're trying to reach, but I think if you understand some of the data and the numbers behind the story and that helps you frame it, that can be a good place to start, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the numbers should be how the story starts, right? And if you think about just how good storytelling is done in general, there are many, many, many good stories, maybe even most good stories that have zero numbers in them, that are still really impactful and can still, tug at our heartstrings or change our mind or give us a new perspective. And so I would look at numbers as a tool and not the way to frame the story, unless there's a really compelling reason around that being the kind of core of the story.
I'm very strongly a why not both person. Like put the numbers in the text and put the numbers in a graph and label the graph with the numbers. Like there's no harm in doing that. I tend to, like, when I approach a long, complicated story, I will skim it first and I'll look at the graphs. Yeah. And I will use the graphs as an entry point. And so I build things like that. But other people are very text focused and are going to read it linearly and go through. And then they're getting the information from the text and then it's being reinforced by the pictures. But the reason they're reading the story in the first place and engaged in it and got past the first paragraph is quite likely because it was about a person or about a place, or there was some through line and it wasn't just a dry academic report.
And I wanted to say, do both. I think that you can do both. And if you can't personally engage someone that can collaborate with you, because our media at this point is so hyper visual, it is very difficult to compete with the attention economy and make any bit of difference with what you're saying. So yeah, I pulled up this example. It's actually a series so that you can see like the close-ups. But this is just a visualization of coal emissions. So waste from different sources. And this is actually something that I made using Blender. And yeah, I feel like the client that came to me was trying to solve a problem of, wow, this sort of data doesn't really engage people, and it's kind of scary, and it's often in numbers. Like, what does 1 billion tons mean to anyone? Like, literally anyone. That's a really big number. And so how can we kind of display this in ways, I'm going to show the other close-ups. To give it like a reference. So this is the Empire State Building. And then these are the objects. But yeah, I think that where you can employ visuals, do that. Of course, like we all come to time crunches. We can't always make like amazing visuals out of what we're making. But yeah, both is my answer. So anyone else? Okay.
Yeah, I have a question. Full disclosure, I'm involved with climate visualization too. But one thing about climate visuals, especially geospatial visuals, is they're gigantic. They're huge, and they're paralyzing for a lot of people. In that you look at something that is the Empire State Building, a huge black cube over it, and then you think of yourself, what can I do? What's my personal agency? And so my question to you guys is, how do you work with visualization in a way to give people agency and to give them a feeling of empowerment in terms of making change with these kind of graphics?
I haven't done it with graphics, is the short answer. So usually visualizations are part of the story, but when it comes to inviting people to make change, it's really about presenting solutions, and those are very rarely presented in a graphic form, in a visualization form, in my work at least, personally. That's really, and it depends on the type of organization that we're supporting. What is the action? Is it some kind of advocacy action? Is it some kind of like, let's show up in March? Is it some kind of let's write a letter, or let's get together and get consensus on an opinion from multiple different organizations all working towards this goal? So I don't personally have examples or experience where the visualization was the conduit to agency. It's more about the context setting.
That's such a good point.
I think there's a recent example from the New York Times. I don't know if you want to switch back to my stack of things, where telling good news stories is a really critical part of this. And that can really help people stay engaged and stop them from sticking their head in the sand and getting feeling despair. So this one was...
Are you saying Eric's example or yours?
Mine.
Okay.
This one was from the New York Times, and they collaborated with Planet Labs to map renewable energy development across the world. And so, it is something that has exploded. Where is it? That's not that one.
It's lower down.
Yeah. Up two more. There we go. And so they showed where there is new solar and where there is new wind globally. And then if you go down one more, they actually broke it down into graphs and showed the growth in capability worldwide. And so they also took advantage of interactivity and had shared versus individual. So shared, so you can actually compare across countries, and then the individual would do a much better job of showing the increases in places like Japan and France, where it's been smaller than the US. But like, despite all of those headwinds, despite the fact that it feels like we're losing the rhetorical battle, like on the ground, renewables are outcompeting fossil fuels because they are cheaper. And like, that's a gigantic success story.
Okay, you go ahead.
Oh,
So, yeah.
Go for it.
Well, I got stuck when you said I failed. It depends so much on how do we see the goal, because are we going to save humans from humans? Maybe not. But you persuaded so many people, and maybe we would be in a different place if you had not done this job. So how do you define your failed or success?
Vibes. There is a good chance that all of the organizations that I helped build and spun off from that are going to be gone in 6 months. And that is terrifying to me, both from a career perspective and from a human impact perspective. So like, we did these things, we were very successful, we certainly hit like viral status and got people to look at our stuff. Do we know we made any impact? I don't know. That's a completely different measurement, and I have no idea. Like, I know the best I can say is that I've inspired people to do data visualization. And like, I just don't know if that actually has reduced the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, or will in sometime in the future like cause an inflection point. I hope so, but I don't know. So like personally, I just feel
It wasn't just you, man.
I know, but like yeah, it's just the political situation right now is hard to comprehend.
If you're a scientist, especially.
Well, on a maybe brighter note, just to get at Robert's work and the impact of visualization, with energy companies, for instance, the more that they're able to have dashboards, visualizations, analyses that they can actually comprehend, they're able to be sold on the technologies that make them more efficient. So I don't think I saw any of you guys at this one energy grid talk. We were talking about the electrical grid. And it's definitely in utilities' interest, which, I mean, let's think about emissions. A huge chunk coming from these, various companies, a handful. So if those people can be influenced by different types of visualizations, presentations, and data that are consumable, it does make a difference. And I think like with Earth observation, that is a way to get the ball rolling. Part of this whole getting to know your audience and warming up to them isn't gonna happen the first time. You get them involved with media and you ignite the awe, which I love that you said. So like, igniting awe is not the one and only step. There's subsequent steps, and I think like they all play a role. So we all have, even if it's a broad visualization, that's getting the ball rolling. Anyway, you had your hand raised for a bit.
So there's interest among my team to incorporate some like more interactive elements into the artifacts that come out of our projects. So like dashboards and ArcGIS story maps. And some of the things that I'm working on, the question that I'm asking myself is, like, where do you draw the line between giving the user a lot of freedom to filter on the data and interact with the data to draw the insights for themselves, which I think is a way to really make that message resonate with them. Like, if you kind of feel like you find yourself like, whoa, that's cool, versus like really explicitly telling them what you want them to walk away with, which is the way to make sure that they walk away with that message. Like, how do you kind of like find the middle ground between those two?
I love this question because this is a lot to do with storytelling. When we're doing a story and we're watching a movie or we're reading a book, like there's a beginning and there's an end. This was a controversial topic in my last webinar for some reason, the beginning and end part, but I'm gonna stick with it. They're going to engage with your content for a certain amount of time. And you do not want to give the user way too much freedom where they're able to click and navigate anywhere. They kind of lose trajectory. And so focusing on what your optimum result is, like really honing in on that, which can be hard sometimes. You're like, well, I mean, I'm putting it out there, but what do you want people to then act on? Like the action part being key. From that interaction, like from this visualization, what is their action by being a part of this? And so with freedom, gamify it, think of like a game, but there's an objective, right? And so that's another reason why I love storytelling, because it's like linear in its fashion, but you can sometimes build in interactivity. ArcGIS Story Maps does not. I don't know who in the audience is like a map nerd, but ArcGIS does not allow for as much customization as I like, but there are other APIs to use to allow for greater immersion and a little bit more control from the user, because I think that's important. I think it's important to give them the sensation of control, but then at the end of the day, it is fairly linear in its beginning to end. If that's, yeah. Okay. All right.
Robert, right?
Yeah.
You talked about the blue marble photograph
Mhm.
of Apollo 17 turning the camera back in the United States, older catalog, and really revolutionizing how humanity saw their place on this planet. Now it's 2025, we're a decade plus into Google Earth. That is on a website. We can scroll the world. Is there any examples that we've seen in the last decade of some collective moment of visualizing our unification on this planet that come to mind for you, or is there something that's just waiting to happen? You said moments ago, Earth science, remote sensing, and climate visualization tool that focuses on accessibility is just an opportunity waiting to be captured. Blue Marble 2.0 or 15.0, wherever we are in the time scale. What comes to mind?
I think like the most, to me, compelling of that sort of genre is actually the pale blue dot ones, which started with Voyager. There, Cassini did a ton, where they put Earth in the context of Saturn. But my favorite is actually the opposite. It was one of the Mercury probes, it was Messenger, did a portrait of the solar system and did going out. And so like did all of the other Earth and the other planets, because Mercury's the innermost. And so you could go out and look, and they probably didn't have Pluto or Neptune. But like it, again, it's a way of recontextualizing where we are. As far as more accessible tools, my touchstone and sort of what I would like to see is something that is acknowledging that graphical user interfaces are better than text-based interfaces. Like Xerox PARC discovered this again 40, 50 years ago. Mac OS beat DOS, Windows beat DOS. Like we know this, and yet all of these tools are command line text-based. And if you say, well, but people need the power, there are also visual programming languages. And so like Max MSP or Pure Data in the music space, a famously technical user base, yet they have adopted these tools, which bridge the gap between the flexibility of a command line and a programming language and the usability of a graphical interface. So that's what I would like to see. And if anybody like wants to like collaborate on that or spin up a startup or something.
Fund it.
Or fund it, yes.
Investors in the audience.
I think that's a really interesting space to be in. And like Google doesn't appear to be interested. They've got Earth Engine, and they're like, oh, but you can just use the Earth Engine API.
So we have time for one more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I also work with science and engineering teams on like stories and things that communicate with people about complex topics. And I have a more like process-oriented question. I'm curious if in the process of making like a visualization, a story, or a graphic, you're thinking about blockers to understanding in your end user, and if there are common blockers or bottlenecks that you kind of identified in your work. I know that there's like probably be very different if you work in NASA or in tech or in policy or like in politics. So I'm just kind of curious if there's one or two examples that you can kind of pull from that kind of involve the process of making something, and if there's a way that you found to bypass some blockers in the process.
What a great question. So if anyone didn't hear that, we're talking about bottlenecks in the process of making visualizations. Did you want to start?
Yeah, I interpreted that as like bottlenecks in terms of connecting the story to the end user. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. A lot of times in our work, it's jargon, honestly. we work with, scientists and researchers and policy experts, and they have a certain way of talking and understanding, and the words mean something to them, or so they say, but sometimes I ask questions, I'm like, I still don't understand what you're trying to say. So I actually think sometimes jargon is used as like a defense mechanism when you don't actually spend the time you need to think about it more deeply. And so that is by far the biggest blocker that we run into, is highly technical or skilled or researched people trying to communicate with lay people and using jargon, and it just shuts people down.
So if you do have,
Yeah,
Okay.
Spin to like the perspective one. There's a photograph and then a map-ish type image and then like an
are you
oblique
saying
image.
down?
I think it's up towards the top. It's the Monte Fitzroy one, it's right there. So go up one more from there. So one of my challenges is working with remote sensing data. Almost everything is directly top down, which is this very alien perspective. So this is a mountain range on the Chilean and Argentinian border. The southern Patagonia outshelf is to the left, and sort of like the valleys of Patagonia to the right. And this is a spectacular granite peak called Monte Fitzroy. But you get essentially no sense whatsoever of that structure and the topography from looking straight down. And so if you go one more slide down, if you look on the side, that's a way of linking our experience of walking around on the surface of the Earth, or maybe being on the top of the CN Tower or in an airplane looking out that little tiny window. Very few of us have had the opportunity to orbit and look from way up above. And so this is just a much more natural way of looking at things, and it's the bridge to this more abstract one. And so I'd like to go, if you go 2 more slides up, from like a ground photograph. So this is Monte Fitzroy from the north a little bit, to that oblique aerial perspective or a space-based perspective if you have control over the satellite, which I've been fortunate to have at some points. And then that direct down perspective, and then to the more abstract, well, here's like an ice thickness map or a topographic map or something like that. And so like build up the hierarchy from people's personal experience to the science and the hardcore stuff.
Well, I think that's an amazing visualization and one of my favorites to end this talk off on. And now everyone can get to the back, have some healthy beverages, and network. I appreciate you guys coming in on a Friday night so much. I'm really looking forward to having individual conversations with you guys. So thanks.
Yes, that's an old. That's like a celery. Oh, nice. But I like it. So,
Oh yeah, totally, yeah. Sure. Okay. Are you based here?
Live stream. We're still live streaming. Oh, everyone who is watching, thanks. All right, end stream.